Utilitarianism is a radically different school of philosophy than what we saw in Immanuel Kant's deontological ethics. They are kind of the antithesis of each other. As where Kant, on the one hand, argues that, ethics must proceed from the standpoint of reason being the foundation, where we deductively determine, of course, what the ethical principles should be, and therefore actions should be right in and of themselves. Utilitarianism, on the other hand, is a consequentialist theory, which means that it is the consequences of actions which are to be determined whether or not your action was good or bad. So utilitarianism is the ethical theory that argues that it is the utility or the use of an action that determines whether it is praised or blamed, whether it's good or bad. Specifically, it's a measurement of pleasure or pain that is typically determined to be to determine whether an action is good or not, or whether it has the most utility. Classical utilitarianism, that in its early days with the founder Jeremy Bentham, who really kind of solidified it into a school, who was born in 1748 in London, England, and then died also 1832 in London, England. And yes, that is his actual body. He after he was died, they preserved his body, and it's in London. You can go and see it. When I visited London, I didn't see it because I was thinking, why would I want to go see this dead guy's body? Now I kind of wish I would have just, I wish I went to see it just to say I've seen Jeremy Bentham. They actually, if you notice his, you don't really see his body. It's all actually under clothes, and they cut off his head because it was decomposing so much that for most of the year they actually keep his head locked away in a safe place, and then every now and then they bring it out so you can see his real head is actually at his feet, is where they have a fake head now attached to his body. So if you want to go see Jeremy Bentham, go to London. You can go see him. But the utilitarianism of Jeremy Bentham in its heyday, maybe not its heyday, but in the early days, what's known as classical utilitarianism, was more hedonistic, and that it focused on specifically pleasure and pain as the chief indicators of whether an action was determined to be good or bad. Now, we are reading more from John Stuart Mill, who I guess we could say, not updates, but makes maybe utilitarianism a more well-rounded ethical theory and political theory as well, actually. So John Stuart Mill was born in 1806 in London, England, and he died in 1873 in Avignon, France. So John Stuart Mill is famous for a variety of reasons. He was also actually a member of Parliament in England for a little while. So utilitarianism is empirical. It conceives of itself as being scientific. That, as Mill says, a test of right and wrong. So just as you would think of science proceeding with the hypothesis and the testing, Mill says a test of right and wrong must be the means, one would think, of ascertaining what is right and what is wrong, not a consequence of having already ascertained it. So with Kant, right, the idea was, well, first you have to understand what the correct ethical principle is, and then you go and see how you apply it in the world. Mill says, no. Instead, you go and look at the world and you see, similar to Hume actually a little bit, how do people behave? What do they tend to desire? And it is according to that then you determine what an appropriate ethics is. That, for utilitarianism, is happiness. That we seek happiness above all else. And so therefore, utilitarianism argues that all action should be molded according to the end it seeks to achieve. So it seeks to be inductive as opposed to where Kant's deontological ethics was deductive. So utilitarianism, one way to sum it up could be like that the ends justify the means. That since it is consequentialist, well, if you have to do a few bad things, that if in the end you end up actually, bringing a great, like let's say you had to torture a baby, but you ended up saving the world, utilitarianism would argue, well, that was the morally correct thing to do because you end up, promoting something greater overall in the end, even though the means to do that, we could say in itself, would be something bad because you'd be producing pain, right? So, for utilitarianism, whatever can be proven good must be so by being shown to be a means to something admitted to be good without proof. And that only thing admitted to be good without proof is happiness. So there are some questions Mill asks where he says, the medical art is proved to be good by its conducing to health, right? So we say, you're a good doctor, of course, if you heal people, and bad if you don't. But Mill asks, how is it possible to prove that health is good? Or take music. He says the art of music is good for the reason that it produces pleasure, among other reasons. But what proof is it possible to give that pleasure is good? All Mill maintains that we can say is that it just is good in and of itself. So for Kant, where actions are good in and of themselves, for utilitarianism, actions are not good in and of themselves, it's only what they produce. And the only thing good in and of itself is happiness, or pleasure, which likely would bring about happiness. And why? Well, all Mill can say is that we just tend to seek it above all else. So that's the only thing that is something good in and of itself, is happiness or pleasure, the pursuit of that. So what then is there a principle from which utilitarianism proceeds to determine what is right and wrong? So remember, with Kant, we have the categorical imperative that determines what is right and what is wrong. So what you know what to do, of course, if it's logically contradictory, then you shouldn't do it, it's wrong. For utilitarianism, we have what's known as the principle of utility. This says that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, and wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure. So for utilitarianism, you want to do whatever increases happiness, whatever is pleasurable. That's what you should do, and that makes you a good person if you tend to do that. Right? Your action is good if you produce happiness. Now, there are actually two ways, mainly, that this principle is interpreted. On the one hand, you have what's known as act utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism says that an action, something is good based on its action, whether it immediately produces pleasure or pain. Or, of course, whether it mitigates pain, right? On the other hand, rule utilitarianism says, no, we proceed not according to just your specific acts, but according to rules that, whatever it is, do whatever action is for the greater benefit of all. The reason why is because, well, of course, if we proceed according to act utilitarianism, there can be cases where maybe whatever we do right now produces pleasure, but it could be because of that in the long run, pain results from it. There are many cases of this where we do things that we think are good now, and it turns out, once we have more information, ooh, that was actually bad. We didn't know. Or even, it could even be that it still is good for you, but for other people, of course, right? It could be bad. Is where really, utilitarianism could say, well, no, we need to look at the greater well-being of all overall, not just that specific action of whether it makes you happy or sad or angry. So whatever is pursued then for utilitarianism is either done so because it's a means to pleasure as an end, or it's an end as pleasure itself. So whatever we do that is good is either because that action brings about as a consequence pleasure, or that action in itself is pleasurable. Mill says, considerations may be presented capable of determining the intellect either to give or withhold its assent to the doctrine, and this is equivalent to proof. Now, utilitarianism has a lot of critics. And certain critics would say, well, the pursuit of pleasure, or the pursuit of, the pursuit of pleasure as the purpose of humanity likens us to no more than, animals or pigs, for example. Why? Why would the pursuit of pleasure maybe liken us to no more than pigs? And they maintain, well, because, if we're basically giving up our rational faculties, that if we just want to pursue pleasure no matter what, well, animals do that. We could be gluttonous, and so being gluttonous and eating as much as you can is pleasurable. That's a good thing. What kind of a noble life is that? Mill, though, does have a response to this. So for John Stuart Mill, there is actually a difference in quality of pleasures, which other non-human animals, so non-rational animals, cannot experience. In other words, there are higher pleasures and there are lower pleasures. So the lower pleasures are bodily pleasures, right? So those are things like, any physical sensation. Those are things which are shared by humans and animals alike. On the other hand, though, there are mental or higher pleasures. Only humans are capable of such pleasures. So, for example, studying philosophy is a higher pleasure. That of, anything involving art, anything involving the intellect, right? Literature, things like that which non-rational animals cannot enjoy, those are higher or mental pleasures. And in that way, Mill is combating that argument that says utilitarianism just likens us to pigs because, well, pigs can't take part in those mental or higher pleasures. Now, what this does actually is it says those mental or higher pleasures are greater than lower bodily pleasures. That, think of utilitarianism as always having a scale, right? What is your action? What is it? Does it outweigh something else here? Well, he would say mental or higher pleasures outweigh bodily pleasures. They are intrinsically more good. He says, it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool or the pig is of a different opinion, it is because they only know their own side of the question. The other party to the comparison knows both sides. So that saying, ignorance is bliss, but Mill would argue knowledge still brings about greater pleasure, even if that knowledge, dissatisfies or upsets you. It is still something more useful, of course, than being ignorant. And again, right, we can say, for Mill, we can say that, yes, it is true that mental pleasures are better than the bodily lower pleasures because we get to experience both of those. As where, again, non-rational, non-human animals cannot. They can only experience lower bodily pleasures. So here's a kind of list of just some select arguments explaining utilitarianism a little bit more. So utility includes not solely the pursuit of happiness, but of course also the prevention or mitigation of unhappiness. So it's not solely if your action, was pleasurable or made you happy or someone else happy, or a majority of people happy, that it is good. It is also if you do things which mitigate the suffering of others, right? That is also good. Mill says, if by happiness be meant a continuity of highly pleasurable excitement, it is evident enough that this is impossible. So utilitarianism does not strive necessarily for a society where we're in a constant state of happiness and pleasure, because Mill thinks that's unattainable, it's unrealistic. And if we were to say that's the goal, well, of course we would all fail and none of our actions could ever ultimately be good, because they can never lead to that. So additionally, he argues that pain is always heterogeneous to pleasure, that they are indeed entirely separable, that no amount of pain could ever be considered pleasurable. It would just have to be pleasurable. Psychoanalysis actually has something different to say about this. But so moving on. Sacrificing one's own greatest good for the good of others is actually ethical, even though, of course, the sacrifice itself is not good. If you have to kill yourself to save others, well, that would be good, because, again, utilitarianism, the ends justify the means, right? Did you produce, ultimately, greater happiness for the greatest, number of people? And even though it would be bad for you to kill yourself because that's not pleasurable, the fact that if it saves other people or whatever, that would then be a good deed, because even though you suffer, and other people maybe suffer grieving for you, the fact that you save a bunch of lives is a good thing. So again, right, so the happiness which forms the standard of utilitarian conduct is not that single person, the agent's own, but again, it's that of all concerned. And finally, the best proof of a good character is good actions. So there is actually this interesting fallacy called the righteousness fallacy. So you commit this fallacy when you assume that you must be factually correct simply because you have an intention to do good. Of course, for utilitarianism, it would be that would be wrong. Well, besides the fact that it's just a fallacy, because of course you're not correct just because you have an intention to do good. You can still have an intention to be bad. But I bring this up again to just make sure you understand. For utilitarianism, it is all about the consequences of an action. Whatever you do, if it increases greater overall happiness, it is good. It doesn't matter what your intention is. I mean, you could actually be a very bad person, and yet we could say, wow, what they're doing is good, even though their motives are bad. Right? Now, of course, if in the end the motives being bad led to them doing bad things, we would say what they did that was bad is bad, because if the consequence, was bad, then it's bad. But it's just to keep in mind that for utilitarianism, it doesn't matter about intentions at all, right? I mean, if you have nothing but good intentions, but you're really ignorant, and you do, and the consequences of your actions just cause suffering, even when you didn't know better, utilitarianism would say you're a bad person. Okay, so I want to turn to two brief counter arguments, we could say, to utilitarianism. There are many, but one is known as the pleasure machine. So this is a thought experiment which asks you to imagine that there's a machine that can give you unlimited, diverse kinds of physical pleasures for the duration of your natural life, as long as you would naturally live without, being in a simulation or something like that, right? But once you choose to plug in, you can never be disconnected. So you are going to experience the greatest amount of sensation. It's going to be pleasurable beyond your wildest dreams. But once you plug in, you can't unplug. Would you do it? You're going to be happy, right? I mean, those chemicals in your brain, they're going to be pumping, and you are going to really enjoy it, technically. So would you do it? The philosopher, for example, Robert Nozick thinks, no, actually, that we would hesitate, and I assume you would hesitate. Most of my students, when I ask this, do say, no, no thanks, I don't want to do that, right? Why? What about, maybe we'll go to the next level, a thing called the experience machine. So Nozick presents this more modified example in his book, Anarchy, State, Utopia, where he has this thought experiment where it's very similar, but instead of physical sensations, right, instead of pleasure, it's experiences. And you plug into this machine, and you can have whatever experience you want, right? You want to be president, you want to be Indiana Jones, whatever else, right? The most wild adventures, you can do it. But when you do it, you can never unplug from it. Nozick still maintains that he thinks we would hesitate and ultimately not choose to do that. For Nozick, this highlights an awareness that even though we would, probably readily admit pleasure is good, it is not the only good, nor indeed is it the chief good humans can experience. Another problem for utilitarianism is that of individual rights. So doesn't utilitarianism advocate for the reneging of individual rights if it would make the majority happier? In fact, we already have the influence of utilitarianism in government, right? If you know what eminent domain is, well, if you have a house, but like there's a highway that needs to be built because it's going to benefit society, if you say, no, I don't want this, I don't want to move out of my house so you can build a highway that runs through it, the government technically can just seize your land and demolish it so they can build the highway because it's for the greater good. Now, the government still will offer you a bunch of money for, your house up to a certain point, but if you keep refusing, eventually the government has the right to go in and seize that property for the benefit of society. Right? So that is a utilitarian influenced law. Doesn't that violate individual rights? Now, someone like Robert Nozick would maintain yes. But John Stuart Mill actually, in this book on liberty, he actually tries to argue against this criticism and say, well, no, actually, because it wouldn't be just that we can make promises and then say, well, actually, it turns out me not following the promise, like, let's say I promised to help someone on their homework, and then I'm like, you know what, I would actually be a lot happier if I played video games instead of spending that time helping you on your homework, so I'm not going to help you. Even though, it's probably likely right, we would, maybe the disappointment of the person would not outweigh the other me playing video games. Mill would still maintain, though, we would have a duty to uphold individual rights, or, in the case of this example, I'm giving promises, because the enforcement of those rights, or, the sticking to promises, is ultimately useful and therefore a greater good to society. So this would be, more in line with the rule utilitarianism. So that's how Mill would respond to this criticism. So there are a lot of interesting ways to try to implement utilitarian ethics. There are many which we can actually relate to this current pandemic, and I will talk about them in a moment. But first I want to mention the famous trolley problem. So maybe you've heard of this before. So this was originally invented, or at least the modern form, by someone named Philip Foot in 1967. And the basic version of the trolley problem says, okay, there's a trolley going down some tracks, and it just so happens there are 5 people on the tracks. And that trolley is going to run them over. It's going to kill them. You just so happen to be there, though, right next to the switch that can move the trolley onto another track, and so not kill the 5 people. But if you pull that switch onto the other track to not kill the 5 people, turns out there's 1 person on that track. Should you pull the switch? Well, if you don't, it's going to kill 5 people. If you do, it's going to kill 1 person. So how would utilitarianism address this dilemma? Well, you would want to put it to the test. Which outcome has a greater amount of pleasure or happiness, or a greater mitigation of suffering? Or we could look at it the reverse. Which action produces the most amount of suffering or pain? And utilitarianism would say, well, of course, it's worse for 5 people to die as opposed to 1. So therefore, you should pull the switch and have the trolley kill the 1 person instead of 5. There are many different versions of the trolley problem. So here's this quantum trolley problem. If you don't pull the lever, the train will stay on track C. If you pull the lever, the train will be in either track A or B. Until you observe the train, you will not know the effect of pulling the lever, and thus it is said to be in superposition. So this is a joke about quantum mechanics. But there are many different examples. So I recommend you, if you have not watched The Good Place on NBC, the final season just came out, but you can find, I believe, the first 3 seasons on Netflix. I really recommend watching it, and they have a great moment where they actually kind of live through the trolley problem and the different scenarios you can have with the trolley problem.
I just don't feel like you're engaging with the material, like with the trolley problem.
That was just tricky, that's all. Why don't you just tell me the right answer?
Well, that's what's so great about the trolley problem, is that there is no right answer.
This is why everyone hates moral philosophy professors.
I'm on your side here, dude, but he is not wrong.
Okay, Michael, trust me. When it comes to human ethics, I just know more than you. I've been studying it my whole life.
It's just that it's so theoretical, you know? I mean, maybe there's a more concrete approach. Here, let's try this.
Oh, God! Michael, what did you do?
I made the trolley problem real so we could see how the ethics would actually play out. There are 5 workers on this track and 1 over there. Here are the levers to switch the tracks. Make a choice.
The thing is, ethically speaking...
No time, dude! Make a decision!
Well, it's tricky. On the one hand, if you ascribe to a purely utilitarian worldview...
Okay, so, what did we learn? Chidi? Talk it out, buddy. What are we thinking?
He thinks he just killed a bunch of people with a trolley.
It's just a simulation. I would never make you kill real people.
Oh, well, that's reassuring, because some of the parts of the fake people flew into my mouth!
Michael, can we just go back to the classroom?
We never left. Here, I'll show you.
Look, see, buddy? None of this was real.
Well, they're fake people, but their pain is real. Does that make sense? There have to be stakes, or it's just another thought experiment.
This is awful.
You specifically asked me if there was a way I could connect with the material more. I'm trying, you guys.
Sorry. You're right. I want to help you understand this.
Thank you, Chidi. So, let's try again.
Oh, I thought maybe we would have a discussion.
No, the whole point is to play out the scenario in real time.
Quick, Judy, what's your decision?
Okay, I can do this. I am choosing to switch tracks, so that way I only kill 1 person.
Oh, forgot to tell you, this is the scenario where you actually know one of the people. It's your friend Henry there.
Chidi! How are you, up, mate?
Eric, move!
Oh, nice trolley.
Out of the way!
I can't, Cheaty. My boots are stuck in the tracks.
Harry, move!
Anyway, long time no see.
Oh my God!
Again, just a simulation, an almost impossibly lifelike simulation.
Would someone's foot really fly off their body like that? That was kind of cool. Ethically speaking.
Okay, so that was Trolley Problem version number 7. Chidi opted to run over 5 William Shakespeares instead of 1 Santa Claus.
Okay, as much as I'm enjoying watching random people's heads fly off, I think we've taken this trolley thing as far as it can go.
You might be right, Ellender.
Thank you.
Let's try the doctor one.
Dude, what the fork?
These 5 people all need organ transplants or they will die. Eleanor's perfectly healthy. Chidi, do you want to slice her open and use her organs to save the 5 sick people?
Chidi, think about this. I'm your hottest friend. No, Tahani. I'm your nicest friend. No, Jason. I'm your friend.
I won't do it. As a doctor, I've taken the Hippocratic Oath to do no harm, and although 5 people will die, I cannot harm 1 innocent person to save them and forsake my oath. It's unethical.
Okay. Tell their families.
What?
Dr. Chidi, my daddy needed a heart transplant. Did you save his life? He was working, then a really bad man ran him over with the trolley.
Oh, come on. What? I'm finding this incredibly helpful. I think I'm really starting to get it. Oh, I know. We'll do the one where you're in a boat next to a volcano and you can either save 50 people or 1 awesome dog or whatever.
No.
But I do want to relate this to the current pandemic, right? Because utilitarianism is being implemented in real time due to the pandemic, right? So a few weeks ago, it came out of Italy, who's been really hit hard with COVID-19, the coronavirus, where basically the hospitals were being flooded with so many patients. They didn't have enough, what are they called? ICU, right? Intensive critical unit beds, I think, to deal with all these people that need oxygen and so on. And so they were having to make choices. Well, basically, we have a limited number of beds, a limited number of ways we can help people, but we have more people than the capacity. So they ended up having to determine, well, who do we help and who do we basically leave to die? And of course, utilitarianism, which it seems to be the way which I guess hospitals are actually, and this is happening actually, this is about to begin happening in New York City. Basically what they're determining is, well, the older person, we're just going to have to let die and we'll save younger people instead because, there's more life to be lived. And so overall, there's actually a greater amount of happiness that can result as opposed to, if you only have a lesser amount of time to live, well, then it's the ethically right thing to do to save the person who can experience more pleasure, who hasn't done so yet, as opposed to the person who already has, lived a longer life and so doesn't have that much experience left as compared to the other person, right? How would Immanuel Kant go about this? Well, you would want to apply the categorical imperative, and you would have to ask yourself, well, you would kind of be condemning someone to die by refusing to help them. Is that universally consistent, right? Because isn't that akin to murder? So I'll leave that up to you as to what Immanuel Kant would think you should do in that situation. There are other concerns as well, actually. Really crazy, absolutely insane stuff, actually, that's being discussed about, well, actually, we have to open up the economy, and so we should just, it should be noble for older people to just sacrifice themselves and die from the coronavirus so we can get the economy back going. That we'll just have to let people go, they can't stay in their homes because, well, all these younger people, they're going to have a bad economy, and so we should just, say, older people, look, you don't want to have the younger people, suffer because of this, so you should go out there and be brave, and if you catch the coronavirus and you die, well, it was for the greater good of society that you, allowed the economy, the economy to keep moving. That's a utilitarian argument. It's also an absolutely insane argument, if you ask me, because the economy doesn't necessarily have to falter. I mean, if this was to last, like, of course, a year, probably be some real trouble, right? But I mean, we can look at other countries where they are paying 80% of people's salaries throughout this entire thing. Other countries, like Canada, I believe, is paying people $2,000 a month, no questions asked. Meanwhile, the United States is, we're not paying any, the government's not paying any part of your salary if you can't work because of, you have to stay inside because of the coronavirus. And you maybe, if you qualify, get a one-time $1,200 check, but no more, right? So this argument that, like, well, we have to keep the economy going and so sacrifice elderly people, well, not necessarily, because it seems like other governments are actually still allowing people to pay rent and so on. So, personally, I think that's it's insane that that's actually being discussed by politicians. I think the governor of Louisiana came out and said that. Crazy stuff. But okay. So, anyways, I did want to actually introduce you to some more modern form of utilitarianism. So probably the most famous living utilitarian philosopher is Peter Singer. He actually wrote a famous essay called Famine, Affluence, and Morality. And here's how the argument works. First premise is that suffering and death caused by a lack of food, shelter, or medical care are bad. Right? I assume we'll probably grant that is bad. That if people suffer or die because they lack food or shelter or medical care, that's just bad. The second premise is that if it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything anything of comparable moral importance, we ought morally then to do it. And so sacrifice here is meant without causing anything else comparably bad to happen, or doing something that is wrong in itself, or failing to promote some moral good comparable in significance to the bad thing that we can prevent. So, for example, let's say I'm walking past a shallow pond, right? I'm on my way to university to give a lecture, and I'm all dressed up. I have my, my dress shirt, whatever on, okay? And I'm walking past this shallow pond, and I just happen to see a child drowning in the pond. Well, there's going to be some considerations I'd have to make, right? Singer maintains I ought to wade in that pond and pull out the child, save the child from drowning. Now, of course, this might ruin my clothes, and I might, not be able to give the lecture, right? And I was really looking forward to the lecture, and maybe people in class are going to be disappointed. This might have to put me back. I might have to move some stuff around since I missed the lecture, to account for that for the rest of the semester. But of course, we would want to weigh here, right? Well, what's more important? A slight dissatisfaction where all my clothes are going to be wet, not going to be able to give the lecture, or the child drowning? And Singer's going to argue, well, the child drowning is worse. For anyone to say, well, I really didn't want to get my clothes wet and I didn't want to miss my lecture, so that's why I didn't save the child drowning. Peter Singer would say, that would be immoral to not do so. Because, again, utilitarianism, we're weighing the consequences of the actions, and letting the child die produces a greater suffering, right? More pain than the, pain experience from getting your clothes wet or missing the lecture. So, third premise. We can reduce avoidable death and suffering by giving to famine relief and other causes like that. And the cost of doing so is a morally insignificant reduction in our standard of living. Just like missing the lecture and having your clothes wet is morally insignificant compared to letting the child die. So this argument, Singer maintains, applies both to immediate emergency famine relief and long-term development aid. So what does that mean? Well, Peter Singer argues we have an obligation to give to famine relief and other causes like that. That there are actually some who maintain, well, let's say you want to make $100,000 a year, but you could live pretty comfortably on $50,000, as a single individual, right? So wouldn't it be actually immoral to live on the $100,000 as opposed to living on $50,000 and donating the other $50,000 to causes, which of course, like let's say that $50,000 you can bring like 5 people out of poverty in some place in the world. Well, wouldn't that outweigh the extra fun you get by going out to dinner more or by buying the latest video game or whatever because you have that extra $50,000, right? Wouldn't being able to save the people and still live a decent, comfortable life be the morally correct thing to do, as opposed to saying, no, but, I could do a lot more things and have a lot, more pleasurable life with that extra $50,000. Peter Singer would say, no, it's immoral to do otherwise than to donate that money of which you don't necessarily need. So I do want to actually look at 2 more quotes as to why it is our duty to give in situations like that. So first, Peter Singer says, if you are living comfortably while others are hungry or dying from easily preventable diseases, and you're doing nothing about it, there is something wrong with your behavior. Now, this doesn't mean you also have to then live, terribly because you give away all your possessions. He's not saying that. But he's saying if you can still live a decent life and donate, the rest of the money that's not required to live that decent life, then that's the morally right thing to do. That holding on to that extra money, that discretionary, income, we could say, would be immoral. And then further, he says, the failure of people in the rich nations to make any significant sacrifices in order to assist people who are dying from poverty-related causes is ethically indefensible. It is not simply the absence of charity, let alone of moral saintliness. It is wrong, and one cannot claim to be a morally decent person unless one is doing far more than the typically comfortable off person does. I do want to say, though, I wanted to give a criticism of utilitarianism, and specifically of the more modern Peter Singer kind of utilitarianism. There is a criticism made by the more socialist, Marxist, background, that tradition, especially, someone like Oscar Wilde, in his short little, I guess what would you call this, essay, called The Soul of Man Under Socialism, where Oscar Wilde actually talks about how giving, like if you see a homeless person, simply giving money to the homeless person in the kind of way that Peter Singer is arguing for would be bad. Instead, the right thing to do is to change the material circumstances which produces homeless people. Because let's say you give enough money for that homeless person, right? And they end up getting out of, they end up getting a house and they're not in poverty anymore. Okay. But that does nothing to prevent the fact of homelessness in the first place. So a criticism of utilitarianism is that it basically, all it does is try to treat the symptoms, but not the cause of the symptoms. And so a more Marxist socialist argument would say that you need to actually not moralize in this way that Peter Singer is doing, but instead try to change what is the foundation of society that produces homelessness, that produces crime and things like that, right? That's, instead what you should do, instead of saying people are bad because they don't give away enough from charity and so on, because the charity alone isn't going to change the fundamental problem of why charity is needed in the first place. So I've got 2 discussion questions for you. What I'd like you to do is first, consider what would Mill's utilitarian response be to the problem of the murderer at the door, right? So that was the problem introduced when we discussed Immanuel Kant, where you have the murderer at the door who is asking you if your friend's home because you're going to, they're going to, kill your friend if they're home. And of course, Kant says, well, you shouldn't lie to the murderer. What would Mill's response be? What do you think he says would be the ethically right thing to do in that situation? And then secondly, I want you to consider, what would be Kant's deontological response to the trolley problem? So, right, the trolley problem is, you've got the trolley going down the tracks, and on the one hand, if it keeps going down the tracks, it's going to kill the 5 people, or you can pull the lever, which switches the tracks and make the trolley kill 1 person instead of the 5. What would Kant say you should do in that situation? Leave the trolley going to kill the 5 people, or pull the lever to kill the 1 person? All right, so just keep in mind that, again, the big takeaway here from utilitarianism is that principle of utility, right? That an action is right insofar as it produces happiness or is useful or produces pleasure, and it is wrong insofar as it produces suffering.